Hi everyone. So for our presentation, we decided to look at the effects of colonization on the indigenous populations in Mexico and how the two cultures have combined to create a new dominant culture, in addition to how indigenous populations reacted to colonization and how the effects of colonization were seen throughout history following colonization. So Spanish colonization started in Central and South America in the early 1500s. We read about how Cortez arrived in Mexico as part of the colonization efforts from Spain. Um, these colonizers set out to spread the Christian or the Catholic faith to the New World, and hence ended up creating a new dominant culture in Central and South America that varied throughout both continents. Examples of colonization that we've seen in Mexico were just things like changes in material culture, such as pottery found before and after colonization. And two obvious ones are going to be the Spanish language and the Catholic faith, both of which were brought in by Spanish colonizers and became part of the dominant culture in Mexico. Following colonization, indigenous populations took on different elements of Spanish culture. So examples of this would be burial sites that were buried in traditional European fashion, but with ceramics and other burial features that were more in line with indigenous traditions. However, many of these like burial figurines and ceramics implemented European features, such as figurines dressed in Spanish clothing. Spanish material culture also became associated with a higher status. Hierarchies that existed pre-colonization started to take on more Spanish material culture as a semblance of higher status. So indigenous elites tended to wear clothing that was more synonymous with Spanish style clothing versus indigenous clothing. Indigenous populations that lived in more rural areas tended to adopt these Spanish customs later on, and even today, many of the indigenous populations in Mexico that continue to have indigenous elements in their culture live in more rural communities versus those that live in centralized big cities. Following colonization, we saw the Mexican Revolution occurred, and which is written about by Mariano Azuela. And so he really, through his character Demetrio, he exemplifies how colonization really robbed the indigenous people of a true identity and kind of created a confusion between following the dominant culture that was heavily influenced by Spain and often heavily showed heavy allegiance towards Spain versus the indigenous culture that was seen as less valued. Overall, indigenous populations in Mexico are still fighting for equal rights and equal representation within Mexican culture. Similar to how they did in the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican government has opposed these revolutionaries that continue to fight for human rights. Even though human rights legislations do exist in Mexico for indigenous peoples, the Mexican government has failed to follow up on many of its promises to the indigenous population, hence the formation of many different indigenous culture organizations that fight for indigenous recognition in Mexican culture. Overall, when looking at Mexican culture, we have to recognize that it cannot be defined explicitly, but instead needs to be viewed as incredibly diverse, and also it needs to be recognized how the history of colonization has affected the dominant culture in Mexico and will continue to do so.
Hi, my name's Nick King. I'm going to be talking about the paper that Gabriella and I wrote called The Effects of Colonization on the Indigenous Populations of Mexico. I think when the Spanish showed up, it had a profound effect on the indigenous tribes that were already living there. greatly affected their ways of life and just how they lived with the land. The Spanish came in and they took advantage of what they considered simple, savage people to get get to their goal, I guess, the land and the resources that were found there. You could say some of the same effects could be seen in the U.S. Tribes were beaten off of their lands and consolidated on the reservations and tried for really long times, even from when I was a kid or just before, trying to eliminate their native languages from them and incorporate them as, I guess they decided it was better citizens. I think some of those same mistakes and atrocities happened in Mexico. They're just finally starting to work towards reestablishing some of the rights of the indigenous people that were there before and view them equally in society. There's 12.7 million indigenous people that live in Mexico with over 62 different languages. And the majority of that population lives in the southern part of Mexico. And there's distinct classes, I guess you would say. I know I've been to Panama a few times, and you could see distinct classes between those that were more Spanish compared to those that were more indigenous or more native blood in them. And it was blatantly obvious. I think Mexico is starting to recognize and work with some of the indigenous that are in Mexico, but they're having issues with it, and a lot of the tribes that are there are forming their own groups to fight for their own rights and their just be treated equally and stop being the minority. It's got a long way to go. I think we still got a long way to go too. But I think the more it can be identified, the better the benefits and the effects the indigenous people are going to see there. A lot of their culture is used day in and day out throughout Mexico, but I don't think many people realize that that's where it comes from. It's going to be a part of getting that back to front and center to where that's where it came from. It's a long road. I think it's going to be a long and painful process. Hopefully they'll get there.